Well, good morning, friends. Happy Mother's Day. I remember our first Mother's Day as a couple. Marianne and I had been married for about 3 months, and we were living up in north central Michigan in a small little farming town called Clare, Michigan. Went to church because I was a pastor. I was a youth pastor and kind of an associate and all that kind of stuff at First Baptist Church in Clare. So Sunday morning, we got up, went to church, did all the church stuff, and at the end of the church service, walked outside, and it was snowing. Now understand that Marianne was born in Texas, grew up in Georgia. She was an Air Force kid, moved to Dayton when they were in middle school. So she had never lived anywhere further north than Dayton, Ohio, and had spent much of her life in the south of Atlanta. We walked outside on Mother's Day into the snow, and she turned and looked at me and said, "Where have you brought me?" That was our first Mother's Day. Well, we've had a lot since then. That was actually our only Mother's Day before Emma showed up. By the next year, Emma had come along, and she was just a brand new newborn on Mother's Day. And ever since then, we've had a lot of Mother's Day. So uh, we're going to celebrate our mothers today. We've talked about that. So I want to say Happy Mother's Day, of course, to all of the moms who are watching. And as Steve mentioned, um, we want to do something special for all of the women who are part of our church family. And so in honor of all of the women who are connected to the gathering, this month our church is donating $1,000 to the Safe Harbor House, which is a Christ-centered, faith-based women's shelter in Springfield. They're doing wonderful work, helping get women out of sex trafficking and all kinds of other issues and helping them get their lives back on track. So thank you to all of you for all that you do, and happy Mother's Day to all the moms who are watching. So we're continuing on here with this live broadcast, and I know some of you are probably getting really tired of it. And every week we kind of take this gamble, right? We say we want to be live, and so what you're watching is me talking right now. This isn't recorded. And of course, that means that sometimes we have to deal with Wi-Fi and competing networks and all that goes into that. So I appreciate your patience in staying with it. But it's important to me that we share this moment. That even though we can't be together right now, we are together opening God's Word at the very same time. And that's an important value to me because what's really important to me is that we're together. And very soon, we will be back together on Yankee Street. So at the end of our time today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about our restart and what that's all going to look like. And so we'll get there in a minute. But first of all, we're going to continue this series that we're in called The 7 Habits of Highly Connected Christians. We believe in connections at the gathering. Our big goal in life is to make sure that more people are connected to Jesus, and not just connected, but also more connected to Jesus. And so our desire is that whether you've known Jesus for 6 months or 60 years, that because of your interaction with the gathering, you are becoming more connected with Jesus every day. And so we're talking about these 7 habits that help us be more connected to Jesus. So let's dive in today, shall we? Today we're going to get to our habit in just a second, but let me start by talking about an issue that's become real prevalent for all of us, probably more so than we would have ever liked. The issue is isolation. I know that this morning, many of you are feeling isolated. Maybe you're alone and you've been alone for what feels like forever. And we're experiencing a new type of isolation that we've never had before. And even some of you who are still working, you're considered an essential worker. You've still been working, but you're still experiencing this isolation because so much of our world seems to be shut down. And now more than ever, I think all of us can say with great certainty, we were not created to be isolated, right? It was never God's plan for his people to live apart. In fact, I would say this, that isolation is one of sin's most significant consequences. Isolation is one of sin's most significant consequences. I want you to think back to the Garden of Eden just for a minute. And remember, after Adam and Eve sinned, what was the first thing they did? They went and they hid because they knew that God was coming. You see, it seems that in the evenings, God would come down to the garden and together they would walk and they would talk. They had this unbelievably close, intimate relationship with their Creator. because there was no sin to separate them. There was nothing to break them apart. And since they knew that that evening God would be coming, and they realized that we've done something we shouldn't do and we can no longer be in the presence of a holy and righteous God, they ran and they hid. They isolated themselves. And then after God came and talked to them about what had happened, he threw them out of the garden and said, this changes everything. No longer can we have this relationship that we've always had. We're going to have to be separate now. And from then till now, we have lived apart from our Creator, isolated from our Creator. But their sin didn't just isolate them from God, it also isolated them from each other. You know, we talk about this sometime at the gathering, how when Adam and Eve were confronted by God about what had happened, immediately they went into this every man for himself mode, right? God said to Adam, Adam, what happened? Why did you eat the fruit? And Adam's response was not, God, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it. It was, it's not my fault. It's the woman that you gave me. She made me do it. Every man for himself. And Eve says, you know what? It's not my fault either. It's the serpent that you made. He's the one that tricked me. He deceived me. Every man for himself. Now, I imagine that night, Adam and Eve had quite a conversation about what they had said in the garden. I imagine it started with Eve saying, so it was my fault, huh? And Adam just kind of went quiet, saying, well, there's really not much I can say here. And the isolation began. And since that time until now, we experience isolation. We experience relational isolation. We experience spiritual isolation. And I want to tell you this morning that isolation was never a part of God's plan. Isolation is a consequence of sin. God does not want us to live apart. That's why when he created Adam, his first response to Adam's creation was, it is not good for the man to be alone. Because it's not good for us to be alone. And that is why our third habit in this series is the habit of group. Because we believe that God doesn't want us to be on our own. He doesn't want us to be on our own relationally, but he doesn't want us to be on our own spiritually. He created us to be in relationship with each other. And in particular, there are two relationships that he wants us to focus on. He wants us to focus on our relationship with him, and he wants us to focus on our relationship with others. Now, remember, these are keystone habits, right? So these are small changes that we can make to our everyday routine, our everyday rhythm, that will have a big impact on our life. And so what we've talked about already, the first habit was worship, that taking time every day to have a personal time of worship. And then our second habit was abide, which was spend time in the Word every day. These are small little tweaks to your daily routine. They don't take more than 15, 20 minutes to half an hour. And again, this is another small tweak to making your routine where you are intentionally engaging in a specific kind of relationship in order to help you grow to look more like Jesus. All right, so let's talk about what that looks like. Here's our value for this week. My vertical relationship is enhanced or eroded by my horizontal relationships. This makes sense to us, right? So first of all, whether or not I live by God's plan impacts my relationships, right? If I'm the kind of person who is always greedy or always selfish or very prideful or arrogant, if I'm an unfaithful person, if I'm a person who's always out for revenge, I gossip, if I hold grudges, I'm not much fun to be around. And those types of behaviors impact my relationships. People don't want to be my friend if I'm that kind of person. You see, if I don't live by God's plan, that impacts my relationships. And if I do live by God's plan, that also can impact my relationships. If I'm the kind of person who's always demonstrating grace and forgiveness and generosity and kindness, then people do want to be around that. People do want to be around me. That increases my relationships. So how I respond to God impacts how I behave with others. But the reverse is also true, right? How I deal with other people also impacts my relationship with God. You see, every single person on this earth is made in the image of God. And so if I mistreat another person, I am mistreating someone who's made in the image of God. And if I'm not right with my fellow man, I certainly can't be right with God. However, at the same time, if I have healthy connections with my fellow people, then I can have a healthy connection with God. In fact, if I surround myself with people who love God and are chasing after Him, I will begin to love God more and chase after Him more. But if I surround myself with people who are far from God and distant from God and not chasing after Him, then I will become the kind of person who is not chasing after God. I've had so many conversations with people who find their life in this place that it's off the rails and they're frustrated and they don't know exactly what happened. But oftentimes their story begins with, I started hanging out with the wrong kind of people. Because who we hang out with makes a huge amount of difference. Who we allow to impact us makes a huge amount of difference. You know, when our children were young and they were growing up, we had rules in our house. We didn't have a ton of rules, but we had rules for them. But do you know what Mary Ann and I were so concerned about was who are our children's friends? I mean, we wanted them to obey the rules, but we understood that who their friends are will go so far in shaping who they are. And so we sought to encourage friendships with people we knew would have a positive impact on them. Now, you know this is true from your own life, right? Probably most of you would say, there are people in my life who have influenced me positively, and there are people in my life who have influenced me negatively. Let's just demonstrate this for just a second. If you can right now think of someone in your life who has helped you be closer to God, I want you to give me a like or a smiley face or whatever you want to put. Punch it into your keyboard or with your thumb right now. Let me know if there is someone in your life that you say, this person helped me become closer to God. Give me a like or a smiley face, just to demonstrate to everybody who's watching how many of us have had this experience, right? I know that I can quickly think of several people in my life who have helped me be closer to God. Because our vertical relationship, my relationship with God, is either going to be enhanced or eroded by other relationships that I have. This is why it's so important that we surround ourselves with people who are pursuing Christ. This is the story of the first church. Remember in Acts, Jesus has just gone back to the Father, and what's the first thing that all the disciples do? They get together and they pray. It says they devoted themselves to each other. We have this description of the very first church, and really we should say the very first Christians in Acts chapter 2. Let's look at this verse together. Acts 2:42 says, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. So this is what was important to the very first Christians. After Jesus went back to heaven, this is what they focused on. And I want you to notice that there are two words here that describe their vertical relationship, and there are two words that describe their horizontal relationship, right? The apostles' teaching and the prayers, that's their vertical relationship. The teaching was, how do we look more like God? How do we be the people God created us to be? And the prayers is our connection with God. But the vertical relationship sandwiches the horizontal relationship because they also devoted themselves to fellowship, which means sharing each other's lives. They just spent time together. And they also devoted themselves to breaking the bread, eating together, having communion together, just being in each other's lives. Because they understood that their relationships with each other enhanced their relationship with God. But you know, they were just following instructions when they did this, because this is exactly what Jesus told them to do. John 13, this is Jesus in the upper room with his disciples the night before he died. And he says to them, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Now, you notice what Jesus didn't say here? Jesus didn't say, people will know you are my disciples by how much you know about the Bible. Jesus didn't say, people will know you are my disciples because of your political activism. He didn't say they'll know you're my disciples because of how often you go to church. He didn't say they'll know you're my disciples because of whether or not you smoke or you drink. He didn't say they'll know you're my disciples by how harshly you judge other people. No. He said they will know that you are my disciples. How? By how you connect to one another. By the love that you have for one another. You see, your horizontal relationships, the relationships you have with other believers, is the single greatest impact in your life on your relationship with God. That's why it's so important that we connect with one another. You see, our relationships with each other are kind of like a lab. It's a lab where we learn reliance, faithfulness, and generosity. These are really kind of the three hallmarks of any good relationship. Is you have to be willing to rely on the other person. You have to be willing to be faithful, to stick with them through thick and thin. And you have to be willing to be generous, to give to them even if it costs you. This is what makes a good relationship. And when we have these kind of relationships with each other, we begin to understand what it means to have a relationship with God. Because this is the definitive way that we show our relationship to God. Our relationship to God begins with reliance. We rely on Him to save us. Our relationship to God requires faithfulness. We stay true to Him even when we feel the pull in other directions. And our relationship with God always leads to generosity. And so our relationships with each other teach us how to be in relationship with God. That's why this week our habit is group. So let's talk about what our habit is. Our habit for this week is to prioritize a weekly connection with other believers. Now, I know this is hard to do right now. It's getting easier. Stuff's starting to open back up, so it's getting easier, but it's not super easy right now, and I get that. But it's still important for us to talk about that, because one of the reasons we're doing this series now is to prepare us for the time when life gets back to normal, to prepare us for our restart. And one of the things we talked about early on in the series was we should be using this time right now to prepare ourselves for that time then. We should be asking ourselves questions like, what am I learning about what is really important in life? And what do I want to change about my life once I restart? And so I'm hoping you're looking at some of these habits and saying, maybe I can't do this one right now, but this one is on the list of one of the things I'm changing about my life once the restart happens. Now, as you look at this habit, I don't want you to worry too much about this word, okay? The word weekly is not the important word. You can do this more than weekly. You can do this less than weekly. The important words here are prioritize and connection. All right, I want you to prioritize this habit. And that means put it on your calendar and lock it onto your calendar. It might mean that you have to schedule these connection times over meals, because all of us eat. And so sometimes you need to meet over a meal. Sometimes it means you're going to have to give up something else in order to get together with believers, because you know that it's something that's good for you. Regardless of when you do it, where you do it, how you do it, any of those questions, the key is to prioritize it, which means be consistent. Keep coming back to it. What does it look like to have this kind of a connection? Well, we have life groups at the gathering, and that's one of the ways that we do this. But for some people, a life group isn't the connection you need, and I understand that. And so whether this is a connection that you have in a meeting with 8 to 12 to 15 people, or whether this is you and 3 other people sitting down for a meal, or maybe just you and one other person sharing coffee at Starbucks, that connection can look however it needs to look for you. The key is that you are connecting with other believers, and that these connections are intentional. See, it needs to be more than just, hey, let's talk about baseball, or hey, let's talk about the latest episode of Survivor or The Bachelor or whatever else. It has to be an intentional connection designed to enhance your relationship with God. So here's what that might look like. Let me give you the specs of a healthy group meeting, all right? So you don't have to necessarily say we're going to walk through these as a checklist and we're going to make sure we do all of these every time, but this is what ought to be present in your connection with other believers. You ought to be sharing with each other. And that means just talking about your life. What's going on? What are your victories? What are your struggles? What are the ups? What are the downs? What are your fears? What are your goals? What are your plans? You ought to be getting to know each other. Secondly, you ought to be praying together. All right? And maybe not just praying together, but praying for each other. So maybe spending time every day, once or twice a week, whatever it is, to pray for the people that you're connected to. But you ought to be praying together. And I guess inherent in praying together means sharing your prayer requests, right? Because we want to pray for each other in relevant ways. You need to be encouraging one another. And encouraging, it does mean saying nice things to each other, but it also means following up on those. So if I'm connected with someone and they tell me, hey, I'm really struggling this week with this issue, then encouraging them means maybe 2 days later, I shoot them a text or I give them a quick call and I say, hey, how is this going? How can I be specifically praying for you today? How can I lift you up? In fact, maybe I can even say, how can I care for you? Because that's important too. We take care of one another. In a couple of weeks, or maybe next week, we're going to talk about gifts. All of us have been given different gifts at different times for different purposes, and we ought to be looking for ways to use the gifts that God has given us to take care of the people around us. And so when I connect with other people, I'm looking for ways that I can care for them because that's what Jesus did for me. And then finally, we ought to be sharpening one another. We ought to be helping each other to become more like Jesus. And that means having really intentional conversations about who we are, about what we are becoming, about where we've been. There's three questions that we can ask each other. And maybe if you're someone who sits down and has coffee with another person and you want to implement this practice, or maybe you're at a group that has a meal together, or even a life group, you can do this. There's three questions that we can ask each other to help us sharpen one another. All right, here they are really quick. What has God said? What has God said? This, what you're really saying is, what are you reading in the Bible right now? What has God said to you? And how is it impacting your life? Second question is, what is God doing? See, this forces us to kind of look inward and say, what is God doing in my life? What are the circumstances he's brought into my life? Who are the people he has brought into my life? What are the challenges that I'm facing right now? And how can I see all of these as a gift from God and his desire to shape me into the person he wants me to be? So what is God saying? What is God doing? And then the third question is, what is my next step? All right? What is my next step? Because when God changes us, that requires us to take steps. And when we talk to each other about what those steps are, we begin to sharpen each other so that we look more like Jesus. You know, the restart is coming, isn't it? It's not going to be long now. We're going to start getting back to normal. In a few weeks, hopefully, we're going to be back at Yankee Street, and church is going to begin to look a little more normal. Our lives are going to get back on track. We're going to be getting back to work. Stores and restaurants are opening back up. All of this is getting back to normal. And so here's the big question. As we restart, how are you going to change or tweak your relationships so that your horizontal relationships are enhancing your relationship with God? That's my challenge for you today, and I want you to think about that. I'm going to pray for you right now, but we're not done, okay? So I'm going to pray for you right now, and then we're going to talk just for a couple minutes about what our restart as a church is going to look like in a few weeks, all right? Will you pray with me right now? Father, thank you so much for giving us this gift of relationship. And we have so many different types of relationships in our lives, and we know that you've given us those so that they will help us to become more like the people you want us to be. Help us to be willing to invest in the people around us. Help us to be willing to connect with the people around us so that we can influence them to be more like you and so that they can influence us to be more like you. Father, I thank you for mothers. Thank you for all of the mothers who are with us this morning and also all over the place. Pray that this would be a day where they feel loved and honored. In your name, amen. All right. Well, let's talk about our restart, shall we? Let me take a quick drink first. All right. Let's talk a little bit about our restart. I want to just, I'll say this first of all. I know that the video quality has not been great today, and I tell you, we've been working hard on that all weekend to try to get it to work a little better, and sometimes it just isn't what it is. So, but thanks for sticking with me and hanging out. Don't worry, very soon you'll have to see me in person, and maybe you'll be wishing you were back to the jittery video, all right? But let's talk about our restart. Okay, I'm going to start with our verse. This is our theme verse for the next several weeks. And as I'm thinking about it, I think maybe this should be our theme verse all the way through November, because we are certainly headed into a time in our country when things are going to get a little heated, right? This is Paul writing in Philippians 2, and he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, right? Don't put yourself first. That's what he's saying. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. If you can memorize those 4 words, that would be awesome. Value others above yourselves. You know, we live in a time when people are yelling at each other a lot, and whether it's on social media or on the evening news or even in person, people on the far right and people on the far left love to yell at each other. And you've got these extremes who are really angry. And you know what? Jesus followers shouldn't be on either extreme. We ought not be yelling at people. We ought not be getting angry at people. That's not what he called us to be. It's so easy in this day and age to define yourself by what you're against, right? And all of us deal with this temptation all of the time, to define ourselves by what we're against or by who we're against, right? You pick your politician, you pick your celebrity, you pick your person, you say, I'm against that person. And that's how I'm going to define myself. But Jesus followers should not define themselves by what they're against. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Jesus followers ought to define themselves by what they're for. And what we are for is loving other people. One of the hallmarks of our church is that we are a grace-oriented church. We choose grace. And that means we choose to value others above ourselves. What am I for? I am for you. I am not for me. I am for you. And as much as I can be for you and for Jesus at the same time, that's my goal in life. And that's what I want to be the defining character trait of our church as we step back into our restart, is that we choose to define ourselves by what we are for, not what we are against. All right? I think we'll keep talking about this even after the restart. In fact, as I was thinking about it this morning, I thought maybe for the very first time in my life, our culture has reached a point where I need to do a sermon series on how we respond in tough political times. So as we get closer to the election, we'll see how things are, and maybe we'll have a conversation about how we have to have conversations. But for now, this is our value, right? We value others above ourselves. So what does our restart look like? Well, if you got my email this week, or you've been part of the Q&A on Wednesday, or some of the morning Bible studies, you know I've given you 4 words. And these are our 4 words that we're going to help us define our restart. Word number 1 is May 31st. That's when we're planning to restart. Now, one of the things we know is that you never know what's coming next, right? And so this could change. And I get that this could change. And if it does, it does. We'll be flexible. But our plan right now, and we're full speed ahead on this, May 31st, we're going to have a 9:30 service, and we're going to have an 11 o'clock service. Now, if we end up needing more service times than that, we will do that. But this is our plan right now, 9:30, 11 o'clock, May 31st at Yankee Street. Here's word number 2, reservations. I know, this kind of stinks, doesn't it, that we have to do it this way. But we have to limit the number of people in each gathering. And so we're looking at numbers somewhere between 100 and 125 per service. And that's less than we usually have in the worship center. So we don't have a set number yet. And the plan is to not sit in rows, all right? We're going to actually sit at tables. We'll have the big round tables. We'll have the cafe tables. We're going to sit at tables because that gives us the opportunity to be a little more socially distanced from each other while still not feeling awkward about having to have lots of empty space between us. So because we're limiting the number of people and because we're sitting at tables, we're setting up a reservation system. And you'll be able to reserve a table for as many people as you need to. We'll make sure we have room for everybody. So even if we have too many reservations, we'll make a new service time. We'll do what we have to do. Anybody who wants to worship on Yankee Street on May 31st, we will have room for you, okay? But you're going to have to make a reservation. And hopefully by the end of this week, we'll be able to tell you exactly how that works. It's going to be a very simple process, I promise. It'll be like making a reservation at a restaurant. You just go online, click a couple things, and you'll be good to go. All right? But May 31st, you'll have to make a reservation for church. Here's the third word, the one you're all excited about, masks. I know. Now, you don't have to tell me that masks are uncomfortable. All right? I know. I don't like the masks, but I wear the masks when I'm out in public. Do you know why? Because I value you over me. All right? Now, listen. I don't want to spend a ton of time here, but I'm going to say a couple of things here because I think it's important. Okay, for whatever reason, masks have kind of become a sign of something else, right? They've kind of become this sign of government overreach or tyranny or whatever you want to call it. And there's this idea that if I have to wear a mask into a store, then somebody's making me do something I don't want to do, so I'm not going to do it. I get it. All right, and listen. It is your call. If you don't want to wear a mask into a store and they demand that you wear a mask in the store, you can go shop somewhere else and you will have my full support on that, all right? However, it is safer for everybody if we go with this policy for now. And so we are asking you to wear a mask when you come to church on the 31st, all right? And the reason we're asking this, let me walk through my thinking on this a little bit, okay? So I've wrestled with this piece of the equation. I've wrestled significantly with it because I know that this is a hot button topic right now. I wish it wasn't a hot button topic, but it is, and I don't like that. But as I thought it through, I thought this, okay, if I go in for surgery, do you know all the people who are working on me are going to be wearing masks, right? Because it's safer for me that they wear masks. If I had a child that was sick, and I had to go to the hospital to visit my child, and the doctor said, you can't go in and visit your child unless you wear a mask. And this is a real situation. Many families deal with this. You can't go visit your child unless you wear a mask. I would absolutely wear the mask, and I wouldn't hesitate because I love my child. Finally, as I was thinking this through, I thought, in an equation, which is more beneficial for the most amount of people? If we say, hey, no masks needed, everybody do what you can, we do risk more contagion. It's possible. I have a family friend who this week got very sick. They haven't been tested yet, but then they discovered that someone they had been hanging out with has tested positive for the virus. They didn't know it at the time they were hanging out, but they may have gotten infected by them because the person just didn't know. And that is the reality of this virus. And so there is more potential for contagion if we don't wear masks. And for that reason, and because we want to value each other, we're asking everybody to wear masks. I feel like I'm spending way more time on this than I need to, but let me say one more thing, okay? This is an opportunity to give up something of yourself, to give up a preference of yourself for the good of someone else. And I don't want to be laying a guilt trip on you. I don't like to do that, but let me just challenge you, all right? If you're feeling a real resistance in your heart to wearing a mask for whatever reason, I want you to think about what Jesus gave up for you, all right? And ask yourself, am I willing to give up something small for the good of others? Now, having said all of that, I totally get that for some people the mask is a no-go. That's cool. That's fine. And I want to say there are some of you who probably shouldn't come to church on the 31st because you're in an at-risk group. And so one of the things we're inviting a lot of people to do is to say, hey, stay home, watch the live stream. We'll continue to live stream. We should be able to get rid of all of the technical problems because we'll be back in our building using all of our good equipment. So stay at home, watch the live stream, maybe invite friends and family over to your house and have kind of a small mini church at your own house. We're totally behind that, and we encourage you to do that. All right? So here we go. May 31st, 9:30 and 11. You're going to have to make a reservation. We're asking everyone to wear a mask because we want to give up our preferences for the good of others. And then finally, and this is the big word, is flexibility. We're asking you to be flexible. Things are going to change. It's going to be flexible. We don't know exactly everything that's coming down the road. We're going to do our very best to communicate with you. In fact, we'll probably over-communicate with you, and you'll get tired of hearing from us. But we're asking that you will be flexible as we go through this. All right? The restart is coming. I cannot wait. I cannot wait to see you in person. I'm going to have my mask on. I'll probably pull it down like you know how the governor, he comes in with his mask and he pulls it down to preach, or he doesn't preach, to talk. That's probably what I'll do. But I cannot wait to see you on May 31st. And hopefully I'll see many of you. I know I can't see all of you yet, and I'm still anxious to see you and praying for you. But very soon we'll all be back together again, and that is exciting. You know, I feel so privileged to be a part of this church and to be your pastor. And we're getting close to 7 years, which is kind of cool. But I want to thank you for being a fantastic, grace-filled church, the healthiest church I've ever been a part of. And I just appreciate that so much from all of you. I know we've probably raised more questions than we've answered this morning, and I can see in the comments that some of you have questions and are asking them. We'll answer all of them. I'll scroll back through the comments later, and as we communicate to you in coming days, we'll answer all of those questions. Feel free to keep throwing them at us. We'll do our best with them. All right? Hey, let me finish up with a blessing. Can I do that for you? So you know that your Heavenly Father loves you more than you have ever been loved. And He is pouring into your life all of His love and His kindness and His grace and His mercy, His forgiveness, because He wants to fill you with that. And if you will open yourself to Him and allow Him to fill you to overflowing, then all of that goodness will spill out into the lives of everyone around you. And you will fill their lives with peace and hope and joy that comes from knowing Jesus. So this week, open yourself to your Father. Let Him fill you up to overflowing so you can impact the people around you. And until we're all back together again, may God richly bless you.